and welcome to the BBXX podcast. I'm your host, Sasha Laurie, and we're here to be your go-to resource for sexuality, intimacy, and communication to help you better understand yourself, the culture that has shaped you, and how to live deeper and more meaningful relationships as a result. Let's get intimate. In the second episode of our talk with Caroline Heldman, we discussed the mental health crisis of millennials, whether or not social media should actually be called anti-social media, and how when the average teenager is consuming 10.5 hours of media a day, the people who have the most influence over them happen to be the same marketers who make money by feeding people's low self-esteem and care more about their wallet than their well-being. One of our slogans is better relationships equals better life. And what that means then for these younger generations, and how is that tied to this intimacy crisis, and kind of what is the current landscape of that crisis, and what can we try and do to combat it?
We're definitely in a mental health crisis that started with millennials, who are age is now 25 to 39. We started to see that early millennials were having a slide in terms of their mental health, meaning far more young people had depression than any previous generation, and it has only gotten worse. So millennials had record numbers of depressed people in their generation, and now Generation Z, we're seeing even higher rates of depression. And this is not a function of diagnosing differently. This is actually a function of shifting mental health. And there are lots of factors that contribute to this, but certainly one factor is that human beings are becoming less connected. And it does have a lot to do with media consumption. And with Gen Z, it has a lot to do with being raised into a culture where social media consumption is the norm. So what we do know about high rates of media consumption is that it leads to antisocial attitudes and behaviors, meaning that you're simply less connected to other human beings. And then you over time develop less of a desire to be connected to other human beings, even though this is a key function of what makes you happy in life. We know from lots of studies of humans that connecting to other people is one of the primary drivers of happiness. What we also know now with social media is the more time you spend with social media, and especially the more time you spend curating your image on social media, the higher your rates of depression. It's not just a disconnection from other human beings that is driving this lack of happiness, these increasing rates of depression. It's also all of the things, the baggage that goes along with being performative on social media. So people's self-esteem, young people's self-esteem is really suffering from having to constantly be performing and curating a self online. What we do know, though, is that connecting with other human beings in real life can pretty quickly shift a human being's happiness. It could also make you much more social pretty rapidly. One study by a researcher out of the University of California, Irvine, finds that it takes about 14 days for a young person who's really disconnected from other human beings because of social media. It takes 14 days for them to kind of reemerge as a social creature, which is what human beings are. And so social media has a lot of wonderful aspects, but it is also driving rates of depression for young people. And so I think the most important thing you can do as a young person if you want to increase your happiness is to unplug from devices as much as you possibly can. Maybe just look at your phone for an hour a day, and otherwise you lock it up. Your laptop the same, like lock up your devices for most of the day. But also reconnect with other human beings. We know it's not just romantic relationships. It's actually just intimate relationships more broadly. In fact, the friendship studies that came out in the past 10 years find that close female friendships and close male friendships that are platonic, that are not romantic, actually have more of an effect on your happiness than romantic relationships. And it's not to say that romantic relationships aren't important, but at the end of the day, if you want to increase your happiness, having a few close, intimate friends with whom you share details about your life and your emotional state will dramatically improve your happiness. And if you get sick, we know there are a few studies that find that your recovery rates are much higher from cancer if you have close friends. Also, if you want to get in better shape, we know that if you do it with a close friend, that you're much more likely to stick with your program. So there are all of these benefits that having, close, intimate friends, romantic or not, can bring into a human's life.
Better relationships equals better life. So for that, what I'm going to start referring to as anti-social media.
Yep.
I wonder if they would go back and recoin it. I'm on the younger side of millennials, but mentally I am an old person who lives under a rock in certain senses. So I wonder how, because it's very clear how the online behavior changes the way we think and act in that sense. But how much is the online behavior just a substitution for time in person with other people versus actually changing those experiences as well?
It's a great question. So social media can connect you to other people, right? There are these great apps. There are all these dating apps. There are even friendship apps where you could find people IRL. But we know that the interactions that people are having online are not the equivalent of having an interaction even over the phone or in person. We know that people online, for example, present a lot more false information about themselves if they're speaking with somebody, in a chat room versus speaking with them in real life. We also know that people engage in activities online, like posting things that they would never say in real life. And so our online persona is both far more perfect than we are. We tend to curate ourselves as being happier than we are, but also we tend to be ruder online than we are in real life, all of which indicates that who we are online is not actually who we are in real life. And so the human interactions that we have online are not the same and are not certainly as intimate or close or honest as the interactions that we have in real life. And it's interesting. I think a lot of young people feel like social media brings them closer together with people, and it certainly provides them more information about what's happening in the lives of the people whom they care about. But it's not actually bringing them more emotionally close or intimate with the people they care about. That's something that happens, almost exclusively in real life or through phone conversations.
It sort of widens the circle rather than deepening it in terms of their social circle. And so how do we help people realize either that, this online persona is different, it's just a curated self, or help people change that behavior? Because I imagine that perhaps some of the effects in the in-person interactions is that there's some sort of cognitive dissonance perhaps between trying to kind of live different versions of yourself, or that the in-person interactions perhaps aren't changed besides by the fact that they're on their devices and distracted. I know for a fact, at least that is one of the consequences in terms of whether or not people are actually losing the capacity to connect as deeply in person. Maybe they're mentally distracted or just out of practice. You don't use it, you lose it. I guess there's kind of a range, but how would you recommend that we help people differentiate and live accordingly in terms of the online versus offline?
I'm concerned about the harmful effects of what it means to perform someone who is different, someone who is perfect. Just looking at the data that shows that people who, the more you engage in that, the lower your self-esteem. So I'm worried about the harms of kind of the false self, not so much in kind of constraining humans. Humans can do whatever they want, right, at the end of the day. But I can see, so disconnecting does help having rules, and there are lots of online resources for doing this. And I think the reason that we have gotten wise, experts have gotten wise to the need to disconnect for certain periods of time is because social media is addictive. So it's an issue where we're not necessarily in control of our consumption and our use. And it takes over our lives in the same way that, video game addiction or porn addiction takes over your life, right? Where, it's something that you crave, just like, the same place in your brain that lights up with cocaine lights up with an addiction to social media. We know that you get a release of the chemical that makes you happy in your brain when you get a message and you look at your phone and you see that somebody has contacted you, the little ding. So as human beings, we don't understand the brain effects of the mid and long-term brain effects of this particular addiction. But I think moving forward, we as a society will become more aware of what the experts already know, which is that this sort of escapism through social media and through the constant addiction to your devices or constant connection to your devices rather than other human beings, it is an addiction. And for some people, it's a real problem. I think for everyone, it's a problem in terms of mitigating our intimacy and distracting us when we are in settings, and just having simple rules like when you're meeting up with a group of friends, the great rule of whoever looks at their phone first has to pay the whole bill. So if you can make it through a meal without looking at your phone at all, then fine, you'll pay your share of the meal. But otherwise, if you flip your phone up and look at it and you're the first one to do that, then you're footing the bill for everyone. So setting up simple rules to make your social life actually more intimate and more present. Mm-hmm. Human beings are losing their ability to be present. And we certainly see this, in classroom settings with the amount of time that students are able to focus on particular concepts or ideas. And if you don't have a rule, for example, against devices in the classroom, forget it. You are competing with, a handheld device in everyone's hand. You're competing for brain space. And so, again, what are the medium and long-term effects of living a distracted life? What does that mean in terms of your ability to focus on one thing and enjoy one thing moving forward? So social media is having these deleterious effects on humans that we don't fully understand. But what we do understand is that it's addictive, that it ends up causing depression and loneliness, that it lowers self-esteem, while at the same time it's connecting you with people and making you feel like you're better connected in the world. And it's also producing a generation of people who are more concerned about political issues. So social media is really a double-edged sword when it comes to intimacy and happiness, human happiness.
So to kind of wrap up that thought and the conclusion to the question, it basically helping people who are listening understand how important it is that, knowing the struggles that females face and the struggles that people who are raised in a masculine environment face, that all of this helps you better understand your own identity and perhaps how you've contributed not only to your side, but perhaps the other one. And as I often like to say, that BBXX is about identity and culture more than anything. So knowing the whole story, without all those different pieces, you can never really understand your own part in it. Hey everyone, quick announcement. If you like what you're listening to, please take just 1 minute to rate and, more specifically, to write a review of our podcast. And if you want more content like this, be sure to follow us on Instagram, where we post awesome stories, do Q&As and takeovers with experts, and have links to sign up for our digital book club, which is actually a weekly content curation. Join us and follow us to help us change the conversation and the culture surrounding intimacy and relationships. Lastly, we're looking for awesome people who are excited about what we're doing. So if you or anyone you know is interested in collaborating, helping out, or working for BBXX, shoot me an email at Sasha, that's SASZA, @bbxx.world. Thanks for joining us as we work to change the culture and the conversation surrounding intimacy and relationships. That's all. back to the show now. The other day I heard some women speaking about kind of childcare and what you mentioned about how, more men are staying at home and But one of the women was saying that in her office, when she has to run to get her kid from school and has to leave, she feels as though maybe people are looking at her and, she has to kind of legitimize it. But then when her own husband or when, some of the other male coworkers have to go, it's admired and he gets, a shout out, what a great dad, or men playing with their children, what a great dad, versus just a dad, and the same as, a mom. Or one of the other women then said that her child was sick and she was out of town traveling, and both parents' names are on the call list, and they repeatedly called her and did not call the husband who was in town and who was not busy.
Right, because we assume that women are the primary caregivers of children. It's a social norm. And so what it means to be a good mom, the standards for being a good mom are radically different than the standards for being a good dad. So for example, imagine if you overheard a conversation where, a father was saying, I'm a great father. I she's got the kids, but I see him every other weekend. And what a great dad you would think he is. Now imagine you overhear a woman in public saying, oh, he's got the kids, but I'm a great mother. I see them every other weekend. I mean, it's absurd, the much higher standard that women have to be seen as good mothers versus good fathers. And that all stems from this idea that women are the assumed natural default caregiver for children. Now imagine a world in which there is no default caregiver for children, where everyone is caring for children in a way that doesn't reflect ownership, right? And doesn't reflect these gender norms. I envision a utopia where we have, a lot of people involved in childcare, and the standards are the same for everyone, right? How much time you're willing to invest and how you interact with that child. And imagine that world. Imagine a world where, or even, an intermediary step, imagine a world where men, are held to the same standards as women when it comes to parenting. The children would get so much time, care, and attention from two parents versus one if we had the same standards. Instead, we have exactly what you noted, which is anytime men are doing anything, it's seen as quote unquote helping women. And oftentimes men will use that language too. Oh, I'm helping out. No, you're not helping out. You're the parent.
Yeah. And even in terms of beyond the whole kind of ethical question behind all of that and what it means for culture, there's also kind of the logistical and economic question behind it. So shout out to my brother, who I'm not sure I've ever seen anyone more stoked to be a dad, always, in any caregiver shape or form in general. And him and my sister-in-law are an incredible couple. And he once sent me an article that was about how people overlook the economic consequences of assuming a caregiver and not realizing that that could be a flexible role throughout the relationships, and that one, it can be shared, but that can also change. For example, if one person has a career where in the beginning they need to work their way up the system right away, and the other person perhaps is kind of in a longer role where they need to get to a point where they have benefits later on, or one person wants to pursue a riskier career, or a career change in that sense, and that people often just look at the trade-off between paying for a babysitter and having one person not work. But the long-term consequences that can add up over time when that person maybe does go back to the workforce and can't be in a higher level position or can't get hired to begin with, versus if they have been able to kind of plan their careers around each other and And that, perhaps in this case, a woman who hadn't been working, if she has, the husband later on, if he decides that because of this measuring stick, he has been pursuing a career he actually doesn't like, because of that shared role, he can then take the risk of making that career change later on. So there's just this whole other side of things that people look at the simple math equation and don't understand the underlying consequences and story. And
women certainly bear the brunt, right, of childcare responsibility. So even if both, if it's a heterosexual couple, both parents are working outside the home, she is still doing the bulk of the domestic duties, whether it's childcare or whether it is, cleaning up around the house. And Chase Manhattan Bank actually does an assessment of what it would cost if you were to cover the salary for a homemaker. And it's just under $140,000, which is well above the national average when you actually compensate or calculate the compensation for being a wet nurse, for being a tutor, for being a chauffeur, for being a cook, right? For being someone who cleans the house. All of those tasks and roles rolled up would actually generate a pretty decent wage. But the problem is that we don't value caregiving in our culture because it is feminized. And so I envision a world where we actually compensate caregiving. And I think it makes a very kind of reasonable, rational, evidence-based sense if you look at it through the lens of the fact that caregivers are producing the next generation of both consumers and workers for corporations. So corporations are getting consumers and workers produced for free, quote unquote free, at great cost to mostly women in our culture. And when you look at this, it disproportionately affects women of color. So I would love to see a world in which we actually compensated caregiving, whether that's caring for an elderly parent, whether that's, proper compensation for childcare and education of people in the educational system, whether that's parenting. So all of this lip service that we give to, really caring about mothers in the home, I want to make sure there's a social safety net. So if that's the occupation you choose, meaning that you are raising children in the home, I want to live in a society that actually compensates women or men in that role. And I think that would actually elevate its status and would attract a lot more men, because I think, like your brother, there are a lot of men who would love to be parents. They would love for that to be their job. So I don't think that parenting should, in the perfect world, parenting wouldn't be, in the perfect world, parenting would be a job, right? It would be one that we value and we compensate. And so maybe you would work part-time in the home and maybe you'd work part-time in another sector, but really viewing it as what it is would also cause us to take it more seriously and certainly put more resources behind it. The reason, again, that we don't put resources behind it now is because it's feminized, which is also the same reason that men are discouraged from engaging in it. So I can imagine a utopia where we get rid of sexism and we get rid of, the devaluation of homemaking all in one fell swoop.
To wrap up, as much as we've talked about kind of the power of media, the negative consequences of media, where do you think we can kind of refer our listeners to? What would you say? Where can people go? I am talking so long for one question. Where can people go to find good media? What resources, what kind of spaces, and how can we help people recognize the difference between the two?
Common Sense Media is a great resource for folks who, especially parents, but folks in general who want to know the content of different media. So, for example, if you want to watch media that is racially diverse and gender diverse and doesn't objectify women, they have a lot of evaluations that will tell you, what is in the content of different shows or films. Also, grademymovie.com is a great website where you can go, and it's for films that are opening this weekend, and it gives grades for race and for gender representation. of the three people, the top three build people on the screen, and then writers, directors, and producers behind the scenes. So it gives you a good sense if you want to put your money, where your politics are. You can avoid films that erase women or people of color before films open each week, if films are your thing. In terms of good media, I think it's also easier to do that now than ever with online streaming. So in research from the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media, we find that streaming content is much more racially diverse, gender diverse, sexuality diverse, and also presents much more complex characters than we're used to seeing in kind of mainstream media. And then, the three stations that used to exist, the three broadcast networks. So it's a good time to get better media because the streaming outlets are certainly providing more on their platforms. And you have to pick and choose, but some of my favorites are Orange is the New Black. Excellent representations of women of color with agency and lesbian identity and exploration. I love the new Hulu series Shrill, which features a self-described fat woman who has a lot of agency and is moving through the world and has become a fashion icon. So there's a lot of good content out there that's being made by traditionally marginalized filmmakers. And we know that when we put women and people of color behind the scenes in positions of leadership in Hollywood, that they end up generating content that is much more inclusive and much more diverse and more aimed at social justice and less stereotypical.
Amazing. Well, my voice again. Another just tangent is that when you said the self-described fat, it made me think that the ability to use that term as just an objective description of some body aspect as tall or short, which are objective body measurements that aren't used to measure somebody's worth. I mean, there are certain correlations with things, but it's not something that kind of is a driving force or inhibitor in somebody's life.
Absolutely. I mean, all the myths about, fat people being less healthy, fat people being lazy. I mean, all of that it's myths. And the term fat has been used as essentially a slur against people who are big. And so it's, I always want to be cautious about the language that I use, but I love the fact that we are, as body positive people reclaiming the word fat, to simply be a descriptor. It's not a negative thing. It is a body type. And I want to live in a world where people of any body type feel good in their own skin. So it's good to see representations of that, like Annie's character in Shrill, where, she's facing fat phobia and myths about fat people all day long. I mean, that's the everyday, the everyday microaggressions, the everyday drip of oppression that fat people face. And she's coming to terms with that, with how to navigate that world without it affecting her, ability to be happy and her ability to be satisfied in her life choices.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Wonderful.
It's been incredible talking to you, and I've learned so much, and I hope and know that our listeners will have learned so much as well. So thank you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Indeed. Thank you so much.
The BBXX podcast, Let's Get Intimate, is produced by Sasha Laurie in Berkeley, California. Dialogue, narrative, and content crafting by Amy Soper. Audio editing, good music vibes, and sound mixing, Daniel Herrera. You can learn more on our website or on our social media at bbxx.world. And if you believe in what we're doing, please do help spread the love by sharing this with someone you care about. Until next time.